grief doesn't scream. It settles into your bones like winter frost, quiet and heavy. Cole hadn't spoken more than 10 words a month for 5 long years. Then she stepped off the stagecoach in a mud-stained silk dress, tripped over a spittoon, and brought her chaos into his silence. Mud. Thick, sucking, horse-piss-scented mud that ruined leather and clung to the hems of trousers. That was the primary feature of the settlement. Cole hated it down here. He hated the noise of the saloons, the smell of cheap rye whiskey, the loud, desperate men trying to carve a living out of dirt and rock. He stood near the mercantile, a towering figure wrapped in a buffalo coat that smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. His beard was wild, his eyes hollowed out by years of staring at nothing but timber and snow. He was waiting for a mistake. That's what this was, a mail-order bride. He'd sent the letter in a rare moment of weakness, a brutal winter night when the silence of his cabin had become a physical weight pressing against his windpipe. He hadn't wanted a wife. He wanted a pulse in the room. Someone breathing. Someone to keep the ghosts at bay. The stagecoach rattled into town, wheels groaning in protest as they churned up the muck. It jerked to a halt in front of the telegraph office. The driver, spitting a stream of brown tobacco into the street, climbed down and yanked the heavy wooden door open. Passengers spilled out. A traveling salesman in a cheap bowler. A tired-looking woman with a screaming infant. And then, her, Celia. She didn't look like the sturdy, capable farm girl she'd claimed to be in her letters. She looked like a stiff breeze would snap her in half. She wore a wool dress that might have been stylish in a city parlor, but out here, coated in road dust, it just looked pathetic. She clutched a battered leather carpet bag to her chest like a shield. Her wire-rimmed spectacles were slightly askew, sliding down a nose that was red from the wind. She took a step down from the coach. Her heel caught on the iron step. She didn't just stumble. She launched forward. The carpet bag flew from her hands, bursting open upon impact with the boardwalk. A dozen spools of thread, a wooden comb, and a collection of mismatched ribbons scattered into the mud. Celia landed hard on her hands and knees, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat. Cole didn't move immediately. He just stared. This was the woman who was supposed to survive the unforgiving winters of the high ridge. This fragile, uncoordinated creature. He finally stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Instead, he crouched and began picking up the mud-caked spools of thread, tossing them unceremoniously back into her bag. "You, Celia?" he grunted. His voice sounded rusty, unused. She looked up, pushing her crooked glasses back up her nose, smearing mud across her cheek in the process. Her eyes, wide and panicked behind the lenses, were a pale, watery blue. "Yes," she breathed, scrambling to her feet and frantically trying to brush the wet dirt from her skirt. It only smeared worse. "Are you, Mr. Miller?" "Cole," he corrected sharply. He shoved the half-closed bag toward her. "Grab your trunk. We're losing daylight." He didn't wait to see if she could manage. He walked to the back of the coach, grabbed the heavy wooden trunk strapped to the boot, and hoisted it onto his shoulder with a grunt of exertion. He carried it to his waiting wagon, a rough-hewn thing pulled by 2 massive, ill-tempered mules. Celia scurried behind him, her boots slipping in the mud. She climbed into the wagon, her movements jerky and anxious. The wooden seat was hard, offering no cushion against the violent jolts of the road. They rode out of town in complete silence. The ascent was brutal. The road was barely a trail, littered with deep ruts and sharp rocks. With every mile, the air grew thinner, colder. The chaotic smells of the settlement faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of snow and crushed pine needles. Cole kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, the leather reins wrapped tight around his calloused hands. He could feel her shivering. It wasn't a subtle tremble. Her teeth were literally chattering. The sound grated on his nerves. He reached behind the seat with one hand, grabbed a heavy wool blanket that smelled strongly of wet dog and old sweat, and tossed it into her lap. "Wrap up," he muttered. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, burying her nose in the rough fabric. She didn't complain about the smell. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding red. Shadows stretched long and sinister across the trail. Cole watched her from the corner of his eye. She was clutching the wooden edge of the seat, so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes darted at every snapped twig, every rustle in the brush. She didn't belong here. She was a sparrow dropped into a hawk's nest. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger not at her, but at himself. He had brought her here to die. The cold would get her, or the isolation, or simply the brutal labor of just staying alive. "How long until we arrive?" she asked, her voice trembling over the rattling of the wagon wheels. "Another hour," he said flatly. "If the mules don't give out." She swallowed hard, nodding once. She didn't ask anything else. She just stared out into the encroaching darkness, her shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Darkness had fully swallowed the mountain by the time the wagon pulled into the clearing. The cabin sat like a dark, decaying tooth against the tree line. It was a single room of thick pine logs, chinked with mud and horsehair. The roof was low, heavy with the threat of winter snows. There was no welcoming light in the window, no smoke from the chimney. Cole hauled her trunk inside, dropping it onto the uneven floorboards with a thud that echoed in the empty space. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur burning the nose, and lit a kerosene lantern on the rough-hewn table. The yellow light flickered, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, exactly as it had been for 5 years, bare, utilitarian. Dust motes danced lazily in the light. In the corner sat a heavy cast-iron stove. Against one wall, a narrow cot. Against the other, a larger bed frame covered in a mound of furs. Celia stood in the doorway, her carpet bag clutched to her chest. She looked around the room, her eyes taking in the sparse reality of her new life. She didn't cry, she didn't complain, but he saw the way her throat worked as she swallowed down whatever panic was rising in her chest. "Fire needs building," Cole said, breaking the oppressive silence. He walked past her, brushing her shoulder, and headed back outside to tend the mules. He took his time, unharnessing the animals, brushing them down in the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. The physical labor was grounding. It kept him from thinking about the stranger standing in his house. He ran his hands over the mules' coarse coats, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of hay and horse sweat. When he finally stepped back inside, half expecting her to be sitting on her trunk weeping, he stopped short. Celia was at the stove. She had somehow managed to get a fire going, though thick, acrid smoke was billowing out of the open door, filling the top half of the room. She was coughing violently, one hand waving uselessly at the smoke, the other holding a heavy iron skillet that looked far too large for her thin wrist. "What are you doing?" he barked, stepping forward and shoving the cabin door wide open to let the smoke out. She jumped at the sound of his voice, the skillet slipping from her grip. It clanged against the top of the stove, sending a shower of sparks and hot ash onto the floorboards. I was trying to make supper," she gasped, backing away from the stove, her eyes watering profusely. "I found some oats and a piece of salt pork." Cole pushed past her, grabbing a heavy rag to shove the skillet aside and slam the stove door shut, adjusting the flue with a harsh clang of metal. The smoke slowly began to draw up the chimney. "You don't burn pine with the damper closed," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to look at her. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. "You trying to suffocate us?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, shrinking back against the rough log wall. "I didn't know. The stoves in Philadelphia, they're different." "This ain't Philadelphia," he snapped. He looked down at the skillet. The salt pork was a blackened, unrecognizable lump sticking to the cast iron. The oats had spilled out, burning onto the hot surface. Dinner was ruined. He let out a slow, hissing breath through his teeth. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. He grabbed the skillet, walked to the open door, and scraped the ruined food out into the dirt for the scavengers. He didn't speak as he grabbed a heel of hard bread and a hunk of hard cheese from the pantry shelf. He cut them with his hunting knife, pushing half across the table toward her. He sat down heavily, the wooden chair groaning beneath his weight. He began to eat, chewing the stale bread mechanically. Celia hesitated, then sat opposite him. She didn't touch the food. She just stared down at the scarred wood of the table. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken regret. Cole hated the silence, but he hated the thought of speaking even more. Words meant connection. Connection meant opening a door he had nailed shut and boarded over a long time ago. The ghost of his wife, Mary, felt suddenly very close. Mary would have had a pot of stew bubbling. Mary would have laughed at the smoke, opened the window, and chased it out with a broom. The absence of that laughter was a physical ache in his chest. Celia picked up the bread, took a small, hesitant bite, and chewed slowly. "Bed's yours," Cole said abruptly, standing up. "I'll take the cot." He didn't wait for her to argue. He stripped off his heavy coat, kicked off his boots, and lay down on the narrow canvas cot, pulling a scratchy wool blanket over his head. He lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another human being in his space, the rustle of her dress as she undressed in the dark, the creak of the bed ropes as she climbed in, and then, much later, the tiny, muffled, rhythmic sounds of her crying into the heavy furs. He clenched his jaw, staring at the dark logs of the ceiling. He was a fool. A selfish, stupid fool. A week passed in a state of grinding, uncomfortable friction. The mountain demanded endless labor just to survive, and Celia was ill-equipped for all of it. She tried. She genuinely tried. But her hands were soft, her eyesight was poor, and she possessed a natural clumsiness that defied logic. She dropped a bucket of water down the well, losing the bucket and the rope. She attempted to mend his socks, managing to sew the heel shut entirely. She tried to sweep the porch and tripped over the handle of the broom, nearly sending herself off the edge into the briar patch. Cole watched all of this with a mixture of grim resignation and simmering irritation. He spent as much time away from the cabin as possible, hunting, checking traps, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed, just to avoid the awkward dance of sharing a small space with her. They spoke only in necessities. Fetch water. Fires low. Pass the salt. It was a cold Tuesday morning. The frost on the windows was thick, fern-like patterns of ice clinging to the glass. Cole was at the table, running an oil stone over the edge of his skinning knife. The rhythmic shk shk of steel on stone was the only sound in the room. Celia was standing near the stove, wrapped in a shawl, nervously wringing her hands. "I need to contribute, Cole," she said suddenly. Her voice was louder than usual, trembling with forced bravery. He didn't look up. "Shh, shh, you scrubbed the floor yesterday. I want a daily chore, something outside, something to help." He stopped honing the blade and looked at her. Her jaw was set, a stubborn tilt to her chin that he hadn't seen before. The fear was still in her eyes, but she was fighting it. "Fine," he grunted. "Chickens. Feed 'em. Collect the eggs." It was the simplest task on the property. The coop was 50 yards from the cabin, built sturdy against foxes and coyotes. "Thank you," she said, visibly relieved. She grabbed a tin bucket of grain and her heavy wool coat, marching out the door with newfound purpose. Cole went back to his knife. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A sudden, sharp squawk shattered the morning quiet, followed by a clatter of tin. Cole sighed, set the knife down, and walked to the window, rubbing a patch of frost away with his thumb. Down by the coop, chaos reigned. The flock of hens was huddled in the corner, clucking nervously. In the center of the enclosure stood Celia, brandishing a stick like a broadsword. Squaring off against her was the devil himself, a massive, irate Rhode Island red rooster named General Sherman. General Sherman was a hateful creature. He attacked boots, dogs, and shadows with equal viciousness. Cole usually just kicked him aside, but Celia was currently paralyzed by the bird's aggressive posture. The rooster puffed out his chest, wings dragging the dirt, and let out a guttural war trill. He charged. Celia shrieked, swinging the stick wildly. She missed by a foot. The rooster flapped up, talons outstretched, aiming for her shins. Celia danced backward, a frantic, uncoordinated shuffle. Her heel hit the edge of the frozen water trough. She went down hard, landing flat on her back in a mixture of half-frozen mud and chicken droppings. The tin bucket flew from her grasp, grain scattering everywhere in a golden shower. Cole should have gone out there. He should have grabbed the bird by the neck and tossed it over the fence. But he didn't move. He stood at the window, transfixed. General Sherman, victorious, hopped onto the overturned tin bucket, puffed out his chest, and crowed loudly, proclaiming his dominance over the fallen human. Celia sat up. Her wire-rimmed glasses were hanging off one ear. Her hair had escaped its pins, hanging in wild, frizzy clumps around her face. She was coated from shoulder to hem in foul-smelling mud. She stared at the rooster. The rooster stared back. Slowly, deliberately, Celia reached into the muck beside her. Her hand closed around a large, semi-frozen clump of mud and chicken shit. "You feathered bastard," she spat. She threw it. Her aim was atrocious. The mud clump sailed 3 feet to the left of the rooster, smacked cleanly into the wooden post of the coop gate, and exploded. However, the sheer velocity of the miss spooked General Sherman. The rooster squawked in terror, leaped off the bucket, and scrambled frantically toward the safety of the dark coop, slipping on the scattered grain as he fled. Celia sat there in the mud, panting heavily, her chest heaving. She reached up, slowly pushed her glasses back onto her nose, and surveyed the empty yard. She had won. It was a pathetic, filthy victory. But she had won. In the cabin, Cole felt a strange, terrifying pressure building in his chest. It started low in his stomach, a tight, hot knot that expanded rapidly, traveling up his throat. He clamped his mouth shut, his hand gripping the windowsill. His shoulders began to shake. He tried to swallow it down. He tried to think of the cold, of the silence, of the grave under the pine tree. But the image of Celia Prim, terrified, clumsy Celia, sitting in a pile of chicken manure, declaring war on a rooster and missing wildly, was too much. A sound escaped him. It was a harsh, barking noise, rusty and abrasive. He covered his mouth, but another sound forced its way out. Then another. Cole squeezed his eyes shut, leaning his forehead against the cold glass. The shaking intensified. The dam broke. Laughter tore out of him. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, booming, chest-rattling roar of a laugh. It echoed off the log walls, filling the empty spaces of the cabin, chasing the ghosts back into the floorboards. He laughed until his ribs ached, until his eyes watered, clutching his stomach as he watched her slowly stand up, trying to wipe the unwipeable mud from her dress. Outside, Celia heard the sound. She froze, turning slowly toward the cabin. Through the clear patch in the frosted window, she saw him. The terrifying, silent mountain man who hadn't looked her in the eye for a week. He was doubled over, a massive hand braced against the window frame, laughing. Celia stood in the freezing mud, shivering, coated in filth. She looked at the cabin, then down at the ruined tin bucket, and finally toward the dark opening of the coop where the rooster hid. A small, reluctant smirk touched the corner of her lips. For the first time since she stepped off the stagecoach, the mountain didn't feel quite so cold. Cole stood by the stove, a thick wool towel draped over his shoulder, watching the door. He had stopped laughing 10 minutes ago, but a strange, foreign warmth still vibrated in his chest. It felt like a muscle he had pulled after years of disuse. The heavy wooden door groaned inward. Celia stood on the threshold. She was a miserable sight. Mud and chicken waste coated her skirt, freezing into stiff, foul-smelling peaks in the biting air. Her spectacles were smudged brown, and her teeth chattered so hard he could hear them clicking from across the room. She didn't look at him. She stared rigidly at the floorboards, her cheeks burning with a flush that had nothing to do with the cold. She stepped inside and kicked the door shut with her heel, a sharper movement than her usual timid shuffle. I'll need lye soap," she said. Her voice shook, tight and thin. Cole didn't say a word. He grabbed the heavy kettle off the burner with a leather rag, carried it to the wash basin in the corner, and poured the steaming water in. He added a splash from the cold bucket to temper it, then tossed the coarse block of lye soap beside the basin. Finally, he threw the thick towel over the back of a chair. He walked past her, pausing just a fraction of a second. "Leave the dress on the porch. I'll scrape it down later." He grabbed his axe and walked out into the cold, giving her privacy. The woodpile was behind the lean-to. He swung the axe with brutal, practiced rhythm. Thwack, crack. Pine logs split under the heavy iron wedge. The physical labor usually emptied his mind, turning his thoughts to white noise. Not today. Today, the image of her sitting in the muck, hurling shit at a rooster, kept replaying in his head. It wasn't just the clumsiness. It was the fact that she fought back. She hadn't cried. She hadn't run. She had called it a feathered bastard and retaliated. Underneath that fragile, nervous exterior was a sliver of iron. Rusted, perhaps. Poorly forged. But it was there. When the cold started to bite through his flannel, he gathered an armful of split wood and headed back inside. Celia was sitting at the table. She had changed into a simple, faded calico day dress. Her hair was still damp around the edges, pulled back into a tight, severe braid. The muddy wool dress was crumpled in a frozen heap on the porch just outside the door. She was clutching a mug of coffee with both hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. Cole dumped the wood into the canvas bin next to the stove. The clatter made her jump, a tiny flinch of her shoulders. He walked to the stove, poured himself a mug of the sludge he called coffee, and sat heavily opposite her. The silence stretched. It was different now, though. The oppressive, suffocating weight of it had cracked. Now, it was just awkward. Celia took a slow breath. She didn't look up. I imagine you found that highly amusing. Cole took a sip of his coffee. It tasted like ash and burnt chicory. I did. Her jaw tightened. I am aware that I am not well suited for this environment, Mr. Miller. I lack the constitution of a pioneer woman. My skills are limited to bookkeeping, piano tuning, and needlepoint, none of which appear to be in high demand on a mountain. No, Cole agreed flatly. They ain't. She finally looked up. Her pale blue eyes were defensive, swimming with a mixture of humiliation and exhaustion. I answered your advertisement because my uncle died. He left behind a mountain of gambling debts. The creditors took the house, the furniture, the piano, everything. I had $3 to my name and a choice between starving in an alley or taking a train west to marry a stranger. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. I am trying very hard not to be a burden, but if you intend to mock me every time I fail, I wasn't mocking you. The interruption was quiet, but it stopped her cold. She blinked, thrown off balance by the low, even timbre of his voice. Cole stared at his calloused hands. The dirt ground permanently into the knuckles. I haven't laughed since my wife died. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. He hadn't spoken Mary's name out loud in half a decade. It tasted like blood and copper on his tongue. He expected the familiar wave of crushing guilt to follow, the voice in his head telling him he didn't deserve to say it. But it didn't come. Just a dull ache. Celia's defensive posture melted instantly. The anger drained from her face, replaced by a soft, hesitant empathy. She slowly lowered her mug to the table. "Mary," she whispered. "Yeah." Cole didn't look at her. He rubbed his thumb over the rough grain of the wooden table. "Fever. 5 winters ago. Took her in 3 days. I dug the grave out back while the ground was mostly frozen. Broke 2 shovels doing it." He didn't know why he was telling her this. The words were spilling out, bypassing his brain, leaking from a wound that had suddenly been lanced. "I stopped talking after that," he continued, his voice barely above a gravelly whisper. "Didn't see the point. Silence was easier. Didn't have to explain anything to the silence." He finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers. "Then you showed up, breaking my peace, falling over your own feet, picking a fight with a damn rooster." Celia bit her bottom lip, her hands folding together in her lap. "I lost to the rooster." "You threw shit at him," Cole corrected. A tiny ghost of a smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth. "That's something." Celia let out a short, surprised breath. It wasn't a laugh exactly, but it was close. "My mother would be appalled. A lady does not handle manure. Your mother ain't here." He took another drink of coffee. The tension in the room had shifted, settling into a comfortable, shared quiet. "I don't expect you to be her," Cole said suddenly, the sudden need to be clear, clawing at him. I don't expect you to know how to skin a buck or build a fire that doesn't smoke us out. He trailed off, struggling to find words he hadn't used in years. I just needed someone to sit across the table. Celia watched him carefully. She reached out, her pale, slender fingers brushing against his massive, scarred hand resting on the table. She didn't hold it, just offered a fleeting, warm contact. I can do that, she said softly. I can sit across the table. And perhaps you could teach me how to build the fire properly, without the smoke. Cole looked at the space where her fingers had touched his. The skin tingled. Open the damper first, he grunted. Always open the damper. Winter didn't drift onto the ridge. It slammed into the logs, like a physical weight. One moment, the sky was a brittle, translucent blue that made the eyes ache. The next, the sun was a pale, sickly smudge, swallowed by a wall of slate-gray clouds. The air turned metallic. It tasted of ozone and wet iron. Cole was 2 miles out, checking the snares near the frozen creek bed. Celia was in the cabin, nursing the last of the morning's coffee and trying to mend a tear in one of his heavy wool shirts. She was getting better with the needle, less blood on the fabric, more straight lines. Then the wind hit. It didn't whistle. It shrieked, a high, thin sound that vibrated through the chinking of the cabin walls. Celia stood, the shirt sliding from her lap. She moved to the window and wiped a circle in the frost. The world was gone. There was no sky, no tree line, no path. Just a churning, violent static of white. An hour passed. Then 2. The cabin grew smaller as the shadows lengthened and the temperature inside plummeted despite the roaring stove. Celia paced the floorboards, her boots clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm. She thought of Cole out there, a man of stone and silence, and realized with a sudden, sickening jolt that even stone could be buried. A thud echoed from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, heavy, and followed by the frantic braying of a mule. Celia grabbed her coat, the heavy wool stiff and cold. She didn't have boots meant for this. She had thin leather shoes she'd tried to reinforce with rags. She unbolted the back door leading to the lean-to, and the pressure of the storm nearly ripped the hinges off. Snow billowed in, stinging her eyes like ground glass. "Cole!" she screamed. The wind caught her voice and tore it to shreds. She stepped into the lean-to. The air was a soup of hay dust and ice. In the corner, Buster, the larger of the 2 mules, was rearing against his tether, his eyes rolling white. Beneath the animal's hooves, half submerged in a drift that had forced its way through the slat walls, lay a dark shape. It was Cole. He was on his back, his face a terrifying shade of gray-blue. A heavy support beam from the lean-to's roof, weakened by the weight of the new snow, had snapped and pinned his right leg. Celia didn't scream this time. There was no breath left for it. She lunged forward, her knees hitting the ice. She grabbed the beam, her fingers instantly numbing against the rough, frozen timber. She heaved. Nothing. The wood was dead weight, anchored by the snow piled on the roof. Cole's eyes fluttered. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. His jaw was locked, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. "Buster, you miserable bastard! Move!" Celia turned to the mule. She grabbed the animal's harness, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the leather. She didn't know how to work a team. She didn't know how to hitch a load. But she knew that if that beam didn't move, Cole was a dead man. She dragged a heavy chain from the wall, her knuckles scraping against the iron until they bled. She looped it around the beam, and then, with a desperation that felt like a fever, she hooked it to the mule's harness. "Walk!" she shrieked, slapping the mule's flank. The animal resisted, sensing the storm's violence. Celia didn't plead. She didn't use a soft voice. She grabbed a piece of discarded wood and struck the mule's haunch. Buster lunged forward. The chain snapped taut, singing with tension. The beam groaned, the sound of wood grinding against wood louder than the wind. It shifted. It slid 6 inches, then a foot. Celia didn't wait for more. She unhooked the chain and threw her weight into Cole's shoulder, dragging him away from the death trap. He was heavy, not just the weight of a man, but the weight of 5 years of solitude and frozen grief. She got him inside. The transition from the screaming white to the dim, smoky yellow of the cabin was jarring. She slammed the door and threw the bolt. The silence was heavy. Cole was a heap on the floorboards. She stripped his coat off, her fingers fumbling with the frozen buttons. His leg was a mess, the trousers torn away to reveal a shin bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. It wasn't a clean break. The skin was bruised a deep, angry purple, and the swelling was already starting. "Cole, look at me," she hissed. She grabbed a bottle of the cheap rye he kept under the sink and forced a swallow down his throat. He coughed, the color returning to his cheeks in a violent, painful rush. "Celia?" he rasped, his eyes focused. He looked at his leg, then back at her, his face contorted, a raw, ugly mask of agony. "I have to set it," she said. Her voice was flat. She didn't feel brave. She felt like she was about to shatter. "I've seen it done once, on a farm. They used a gate. She didn't have a gate. She had the handle of a broken broom and the strips of his ruined shirt. She gave him a piece of leather to bite on. When she pulled the bone back into place, the sound was like a dry branch snapping. Cole's muffled scream vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't stay conscious for long after that. She spent the night on the floor beside him. She stoked the stove until the iron turned a dull red. She wrapped him in every fur they owned, then stripped off her own wet, frozen dress and climbed in beside him. She pressed her back against his chest, her skin to his skin, trying to force her warmth into his cooling blood. She listened to the wind. It sounded less like a monster now, and more like a fading memory. Morning came with a blinding, silent light. The snow was piled halfway up the door, sealing them in. Cole moved. He groaned, his hand reaching out instinctively, finding her shoulder. He didn't pull away. For the first time, his touch wasn't accidental or begrudging. It was heavy and sure. "You're a clumsy woman, Celia," he whispered, his voice a ruined scrape of its former self. She turned to look at him. His eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were tired, bloodshot, and entirely present. "And you're a stubborn man, Cole Miller," she replied, her own voice cracking. He didn't smile, not yet, but the corners of his mouth twitched, a tiny seismic shift in the landscape of his face. He pulled her closer, the scent of wood smoke and sweat and survival thick between them. The mountain was still there, indifferent and brutal. The winter was far from over. But the silence that had lived in the cabin for 5 years had finally been broken by the sound of two people breathing in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, the cold didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. If Cole and Celia's fight for survival in the brutal high country struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We tell raw, unfiltered Western stories about flawed people finding something real in the dirt and snow. Share this video with someone who appreciates a hard-earned romance that doesn't pull its punches. Drop a comment below letting us know your favorite moment from their journey. Thanks for riding along, and see you next time.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, Father sent his The Grieving Mountain Man hadn't smiled in years until Clumsy mail order bride made him laugh again. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling in this story was hope. Watching someone carry grief for so long and slowly begin to open their heart again was what made this journey so memorable. The relationship between Cole and Celia wasn't built on perfection. It grew through awkward moments, patience, resilience, and a few unexpected laughs along the way. One gentle lesson I took from this story is that healing often happens when we least expect it. Sometimes another person doesn't remove our pain, but they help us carry it a little differently. Do you think Cole's life started to change the moment he laughed again? Or had it been changing long before that? And what scene stayed with you the most? In everyday life, it's easy to overlook the value of simple companionship, kindness, and showing up for someone who's struggling. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man stories, feel free to like or subscribe for more.